Hi, Bruce here, and today I'm going to share a little bit about Genesis. It's the first book in the Bible, and it was written by Moses around 1450 BC. It's the first the first set of five books in the Old Testament, are sometimes called the books of Moses or the Torah, and they're really sacred to not only Christians but also Jews and Muslims. So they really cross a lot of boundaries. The main message in Genesis is that God created the world. It talks about the story of sin, and that even some of these Bible heroes, the early people in the Bible, disobeyed God's plan, and God gave us that free will to make choices. But God did make a covenant, and God promises to help and protect people. Following Him will ultimately lead to blessings, and great examples of that are Noah and Isaac. God is looking for people today to follow him and to proclaim God's truth and love to all. And it's really why he set up Israel. So the first story in the book of Genesis is the story of creation in Adam and Eve. In Genesis 1:3, God says, "Let there be light." And he ends up creating the heavens and earth in 6 days. And then on the seventh day, creates a day of holy observance or rest. And then in the actual creation of man, Adam is created first in God's likeness, and then Eve is created from his rib. And that's where the story of sin comes in. Now, the way I like to think about sin and as it relates to the Bible is that it represents disobedience. So the opposite of sin is obedience. But if you think about sin as disobedience, there's a snake that tricks Eve into eating from the tree of conscience, and that was a tree that provided awareness of right and wrong, good and bad, and caused eventual death. She eats from that tree, and it condemns man to die and women to painful childbirth. And then they have a couple of children, Cain and Abel, and Cain kills Abel out of jealousy. But the lesson in that story of creation is that we have choices and that God gives us the power to choose. And if we didn't have the choice to choose, obedience would be kind of hollow because we'd have to do it. But when we have that choice, it's a chance to demonstrate every time obedience with every decision that we make. And God wants us to make good decisions and to be obedient to Him. The next story in Genesis is the story of Noah. And God at that time had thought that the world was becoming disobedient, and so he charges Noah to build an ark. And Genesis 6:15 talks about that. Noah is a faithful servant of God, and his family and two of every animal was spared. They get put on the ark. Noah's 600 years old at the time, and it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, wipes out mankind except for Noah on the boat. And the lesson in there is that Noah lived a long and fruitful life because of his obedience, or the opposite of sin. And that pays off ultimately. And from Noah's three sons came all the nations of the earth. The next interesting story within Genesis is the Tower of Babel, and it's found in Genesis 11. The temple tower was going to be built, and it was supposed to be very tall to represent mankind's power. And God gave people at that time different languages so that they couldn't communicate when they were trying to build this tower, and the tower doesn't ultimately get built. So the lesson in here is a really huge lesson that I think we all wrestle with from time to time, which says, when the things of the world, whether it's cars, a big house, fancy jobs, things that you have, the towers, um, if they're used to give you self-worth, they take the focus off of God. Now, as we talk about those things aren't inherently bad, but and we should be free to develop ourselves, but we can't let those things replace God. So a good thing to think about as I think about this story is, what towers do you have in your life? What are the things in your life that remove you from thinking about God? It's a great question to ponder on, and one I think we can all identify with. The next part is the story of Abraham. Now, this story, the guy's name is actually Abram when the story starts out, but God changes his name when he's 99 years old to Abraham. And Abraham means father of many nations. And so there's two wicked cities at the time, Sodom and Gomorrah, in God's eyes. And uh, Abraham has a nephew, and the nephew's name is Lot. And so God lets Lot and his wife escape. Now, Lot's wife, against the advice of God or the instruction of God, looks back at the city and gets turned into a pillar of salt. And that can be found in Genesis 19:26. In Genesis 22, Abraham waits years for a son. And then God asks for the ultimate sacrifice. He says, "Can you sacrifice your son as a burnt offering?" Abraham obeys, takes him up over the course of several days, and at the last second, God reveals that it was only a test, and asked him to sacrifice an animal instead. So Abraham was faithful throughout that and was rewarded later in life for his faithfulness. And so the story of Abraham really, the lesson in that one is that these are examples of faith in extreme circumstances. It teaches us what a life of faith looks like. Now, the story of Isaac is about Abraham's son. So Abraham's son Isaac inherits everything from his dad, including God's promise to make Israel into a great, great nation. He marries Rebekah, and that's a wife that other people chose for him. And the lesson in that is that Isaac was faithful in obedience, and he put God's will above his own will. And that's a great example for us. So Isaac goes on to have two sons, and Esau, which I'm probably mispronouncing, was the hairy outdoorsy type, and he was dad's favorite. And Jacob was the other son. He liked cooking and was mom's favorite. So Jacob and mom, Jacob was the one who liked cooking, tricked Isaac into giving his blessings to Jacob. And how he did that was he basically wore a furry costume that tricked his dad, who was near blind at the time, Isaac, into thinking that he was also hairy and that it was the other son. So Isaac gives him his blessing, and Jacob, who was the twin that liked to cook and did the fairy, the fake hairy thing, gets tricked into marrying the wrong girl, Leah. And he works an additional 7 years to marry Rachel. So in Genesis 35:10, he talks about, or the Bible talks about God changing Jacob's name to Israel. And the interesting thing about Israel, the name Israel, is it actually means he struggles with God. Jacob ends up going on to have 12 sons, and those sons end up leading the 12 tribes of Israel. So the lesson in all of that is that for Jacob, he was a hard worker. He wrestled with God, wrestled with making the right decisions, wrestled with obedience. He made a lot of mistakes, but his hard work represents an example of how we can serve and how we can serve for God. And the last major story within the book of Genesis is the story of Joseph. And Joseph had a fancy coat. You might have heard of Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat. The story of Joseph is that his brothers end up faking his death. They drench the coat in blood and make the dad think that he's dead. And then they sell him into slavery. Now he gets thrown into a prison after that, so he's really having a bad day, and ends up helping a leader later on predict famine. And the leader puts him in charge of Egypt and preparations for preparing for the famine to make sure that they have enough food. He ends up ultimately being in a position where he can help his brothers with food, the same brothers who sold him into slavery. So the lesson in Joseph's story is that life can be unfair, but it develops strong character in us and works out for a greater good. So in summary, even the great people in the Bible failed. The great early people in the book of Genesis, they failed. And they got their motivation and courage by realizing that God was always with them, even though they had flaws. And they're great examples of how we can be faithful to God, to rely on him for guidance, and to use the potential that he gave to us for his purpose. And that's Genesis in 10 minutes.